name is Brian Schlisek, the new director of the Institute of Pastoral Studies at Loyola University, Chicago. And I have the great privilege of introducing and then fielding questions for our plenary session this evening by Father Robert Schreiter. Father Schreiter is a priest and member of the Missionaries of the Precious Blood. He received his doctorate in theology from the University of Nijmegen and has published 17 books in the area of enculturation, world mission, and reconciliation. He's past president of both the American Society of Missiology and of the Catholic Theological Society of America. In addition to holding guest professorships at universities in Germany and the Netherlands, he's lectured in over 50 countries around the world. And for 12 years, Father Schreiter served as a theological consultant to Caritas International for its programs in reconciliation and peace building. And he continues to work with organizations and groups around the world in peace building. He lectures in academic and church circles on enculturation, intercultural communication, reconciliation, religious life, and world mission. We're pleased to have him with us tonight to speak on religion, displaced and replaced, what we have to learn from diaspora communities. Father Schreiter.
Thank you, Brian, for that introduction. Happy to be here yet again for World Catholicism Week. It's something we here in Chicago look forward to each year. As Brian indicated, the title of my paper this evening is Religion Displaced and Replaced, What We Have to Learn from Diaspora Communities. The vast flow of migrating peoples that now encircles the planet has set off a whole new era in transnational and in diaspora studies. What happens to people as they leave their home territories and settle in new places? How does this affect their views and their relationships to the places they call home? How do the circumstances under which they left, be they the economic push and pull factors of being pushed out of their home country or being pulled by hopes of economic betterment, the trauma of armed conflict or persecution, or now escaping environmental meltdown and catastrophes, which is going to be one of the major issues in migration in the coming decades. How do these things shape their understanding of themselves, where they come from, and where they land after their journeys? And what of those places that become their new homes, so to speak? What are the historical horizons out of which a nation views its newcomers? So, for example, Europe would look to the United States and Canada and say, well, you are nations of immigrants, so you know how to deal with immigrants. We are not nations of immigrants, but now they are. How is a nation changed by those who arrive at their borders? And in the midst of globalization's flows, much touted, of capital, goods, and ideas, where does the more problematic flow of people find its place? These, and a host of other questions, fuel current discussions in migration and the overarching fields that are now emerging of transnational and diaspora studies. Indeed, the paired fields of study of transnational and diaspora are not entirely discrete areas of inquiry. They often address the same populations and certainly address the same contexts, albeit viewed from different perspectives. It might be helpful here at the beginning to give a rough definition of each of these, of transnational and diaspora studies, especially in light of their relationship to each other. Transnational studies follow the flow of human population across national boundaries and have indeed those boundaries of the nation state always in the forefront of their concerns. How migrating populations see themselves, or seen by others, is measured against the conception of the nation-state. Now, it should be recalled here that the Western notion of the nation-state, as it emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, saw itself, the nation-state, as a collection of nations in the sense of distinct cultures. Indeed, the meaning of the Latin word natio is equivalent to what we now call culture in the modern sense of the term. And this still actually exists in some places. If you go to the University of Uppsala in Sweden, the student housing traditionally was organized around 13 nations. And these were different parts of Sweden. So Ostgotland, Göteborg, Stockholm, these were considered separate nations. The nation-state then, as it was conceived starting in the early modern period, was a collection of nations that were bound together via contract in the abstract conception of a state, which the state then considered itself a kind of ersatz nation, or supraculture, embracing the various nations as though it were a nation itself. People migrating into a nation-state then, according to this thinking, are perceived either as losing their own nation affiliation and merging into the supraculture of the nation-state, or resisting that amalgamation and maintaining some measure of cultural identity. Current discussions of multicultural policy and so-called multicultural nation-states are usually designed along those lines of relative allegiance to one or other nation within the nation-state. Thus, terms like assimilation, integration, autonomy, and the like are all calibrated according to the metrics of the nation-state, which is seen as needing to be preserved at all costs. Not only is this framework at play in terms of immigration, but also in discussions and policy formation regarding culturally autonomous regions within nation-states, as different as Spain, where you have issues here around Catalonia and the Basque territories, and now, for example, in the Philippines, with the Bangsamoro peace agreement for Mindanao in that country. This will become a relatively autonomous area, Muslim majority, within an otherwise largely Christian nation. So that's transnational studies, where the concept of the nation-state kind of provides the framework for looking at the movement of peoples. Diaspora studies, on the other hand, looks less to the relation of the new arriving population to the nation-state, but rather more to their community formation, the new arrivals, their community formation within the new country. Now, diaspora, in how this area of study is being developed, is not equivalent to dispersal. An immigrant population may enter a country, but may or may not congregate into distinctive enclaves. And sometimes national policy is such as to discourage or even obfuscate such community formation. For example, in this country, this was the case with the first wave of Vietnamese refugees that came to the United States in 1975. They were deliberately located at dispersed locations so as to avoid the kind of concentration of people that arrived with the exodus from Cuba in the 1960s that Sister Undina Cortes talked about before. What had happened with the Cuban arrival had a big effect on U.S. policy when the Vietnamese started to arrive, because they saw all the political consequences that come with having these kinds of enclaves. Diaspora, in the current understanding of the concept, means that immigrating populations form an enclave, and this enclave sets up new networks of relationships, both among the immigrants themselves and with both the host country and the homeland. These networks, both those that help constitute the diaspora community itself and those that define its relationship to other communities, are the horizons or frameworks by which the diaspora communities are understood and interacted with. Now, what I'm presenting to you here this evening is going to focus on the diaspora communities, as indeed this entire conference is, rather than their transnational relationships, although these, of course, cannot be completely separated. But by concentrating on diaspora and diasporic relationships should yield some particular insights, not only into the movements of peoples today, but their impact on how we see more settled populations, and perhaps more importantly, how we view the whole. Now, in order to do this, I'll begin with a closer investigation of some of the dynamics of diaspora communities as they are being discussed in the current literature. Then the focus will move to the role of religion within these dynamics, which provides the backdrop for our discussions here this week. More specifically, the experience of Catholic faith within the diaspora will be examined further under the two experiences of place within the diaspora experience. I'll say more about place here in a moment, of being displaced from one's homeland and of being replaced in the setting of a new diasporic community within a new context. In fact, I'm going to play with the double meaning of replace, that it's both resituated, but it's also being substituted, as we see some of those dynamics at work. Some of the meanings of these, both for the diasporic communities themselves, but also for the larger religious social configurations in which they find themselves, will be the object here of my investigation. What this presentation tries to do then, admittedly only in bare outline, is bring together some of what we are learning about the dynamics of religion in migrant communities as diaspora communities within the larger discussion about diaspora communities that is going on today. So first, something about the dynamics of diaspora. The term diaspora, in its original Greek meaning, means spread throughout. That was already mentioned earlier this afternoon. It referred to peoples in ancient Greece who were usually forcibly relocated to another place. It gained greater currency in the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible to refer to the relocation of the Jews from the northern and southern kingdoms in the Babylonian exile, and then later the expulsion of the Jews from Judea in the 1st century, the Common Era. That came to be included as well. Diaspora has continued to have special reference to the Jewish experience of such dispersion, although it has come to denote the forced relocation of other peoples as well, most notably that of Africans in the Atlantic slave trade, on the one hand, and the imperial relocation of peoples such as populations from India that were spread out through the British Empire. And it can also refer to dispersions that have resulted from the pursuit of commerce. So one thinks of the Chinese diaspora in that regard. Now, as a discrete field of inquiry, what is called diaspora studies is relatively recent. It builds upon studies of specific communities, especially Jewish communities, but is broadened out in attempts to make a more comprehensive view of the phenomenon. As already noted, it distinguishes itself from the broader field of transnational studies in taking the diaspora community as its point of departure. Now, the literature being collected on diaspora studies is configured methodologically by a sense of dialectic, that is to say, a sort of back and forth movement between two foci. And there are two distinctive sets of dialectics that come most into play in what's being written under this rubric today. The first of these dialectics is between continuity and discontinuity, referring here to the temporal experience of populations in relationship to their homeland. There is a strong sense of then, when they were at home, and now, an experience of alienation. And those patterns of time were referred to by Father Llewellyn in the previous session. The second set of dialectics is between space and place, which is, if the first is more temporal, this is a more spatially constructed experience about the location one inhabits in relationship to the homeland. Now, continuity, discontinuity captures especially the experience of rupture or alienation from one's previous experience as one is propelled into new, different, and sometimes hostile environments. Many of the features of one's life that heretofore anchored one's identity are swept away. In the new environment, others are not aware of one's status or position in a society. So think of the number of immigrants and refugees, say, for example, who were physicians in their home country but are not licensed when they come here and end up being orderlies. Nor are, in the new environment, people aware of the achievements that people have made in the homeland, or even how they view themselves. In the midst of the experience of profound disruption, which is part of the migrant experience, and even more strong for the refugee or the exile, the past that is encountered within this experience in the new setting is a past that has been served up by memory. The remembered past often takes on a more uniform, uninterrupted, and smooth patina than was likely the case in the unfolding of the actual events. Indeed, sometimes the past and the homeland become romanticized as an almost unfallen state of nature compared to the travails of the present. Indeed, the discontinuities of the present, where one is not recognized, where one might be even rendered invisible, can overwhelm and drive this dialectic between present and past. The stress under which first-generation migrants and refugees live, even when they freely embrace their new setting, can be considerable. It is marked especially by this disjunction between present and past. As one probes more below the surface of the tumultuous present and the serene, or at least remembered as serene, past, one may find that the symmetry of continuity, discontinuity might be better expressed by what Daniel Barber has called a dialectic of integrity and discontinuity. In other words, the experience of the past is not so much one of an objective, disinterested flow of events as it is a moral configuration that sheds a harsh light on the brokenness and alienation of the present. The past coheres in a moral, even aesthetic, unity that belies the disheveled, disordered experience of the present. It implies that any progress toward a more coherent experience of self and community in the present will need to be patterned upon and judged against the remembered experience of the past. The emphasis here, again, is on the remembered experience of the past. This is of crucial importance, since the past was rarely as ordered as it may now be remembered. Nor is that past so stable that it continues to be replicated in what is now the present of the homeland. This latter dynamic is played out, often tragically, in the experience of first-generation migrants who were able to return to their homelands after an extended absence, only to discover how much their homeland has changed from the one that they carry in their memories. We've had graphic examples of that here in Chicago. We have two large refugee exile communities of Ukrainians and Lithuanians. And through the years after the Second World War, when they had fled communism, that they wanted to be ready to be able to go back. So their children had to go to language school on Saturdays rather than watch cartoons or play sports. And then, of course, in 1991, it became possible to go back. And some did. And I know in talking with some of them, almost all of them returned to the United States because they said, that is not the Ukraine I remember. That is not the Lithuania I remember. Remember, the Ukrainians say there's now so many Russian words in Ukraine, and the relationships have become so coarsened. Of course, we're seeing some of those trauma being played out right now in Ukraine. In one instance, a wealthy Canadian went back to Ukraine and then was asked by the people in Ukraine to go back to Canada. Because what he was trying to impose was not where they were. Because these cultures don't stand still. They continue to change as well. The dialectic of continuity, discontinuity, then, is a powerful force in shaping the experience of diaspora communities. It provides a representation of the homeland in memory, that ever-changing relationship memory is between the past and the present. It continues to shape the defining boundaries between the diaspora community and other communities in their new setting. I think Sister Cortez made this point very clear when talking about the sense of mission that current exiles have, Cuban exiles have. You know, there must be, they're finding purpose in their exilic diaspora, to use Fernando Segovia's term. But it's still being very much oriented towards that return. And particularly for those Cubans who have been able to go back, especially the first time, it's again not the Cuba they remember. You know, the things have continued to change there as well. So it shapes the boundaries between the diaspora community and other communities, and it shapes also, both subtly and not so subtly, relationships within the diaspora community itself. The diaspora communities are often so divided and riven with disputes that to outsiders seem to be over trivial matters is indicative of how this dialectic continues to work. The moral dimension that Barber's proposal of integrity versus continuity suggests helps clarify the emotional intensity that often marks the adversarial relationships that emerge in these communities. If I could use an example from another Christian group, even though Catholics are our focus, if you go to Koreatown here in Chicago, you will find a huge multiplicity of Presbyterian churches. And part of it is built into Reformed polity, where you have the head of the congregation, you know, the ruling elder, and then you have the teaching elder, who's the minister. And often the tensions that come to rest in these communities often have very little to do with the community itself, but sometimes from outside forces. And so there will be splits. Who's going to follow the ruling elder? Who's going to follow the teaching elder? And so suddenly you have two Presbyterian congregations. I have a student at the moment who was wanting to write on reconciliation, who's an assistant pastor in one of these parishes, these congregations, and the split came, and he was asked as assistant pastor, now whose side are you going to be on? Are you going with the president of the congregation, or are you going with the minister? So he says, I've learned a lot more about reconciliation than I had planned on. The second set of dialectics that gives methodological shape to diaspora studies is between space and place. Space here, generally speaking, the literature is not consistent, refers to the coordinates into which diaspora groups are thrust. It is to be understood as encompassing both physical and social space. The physical space may not be in dimensions that foster human relationships and flourishing. One thinks here of the refugee camp, and in situations like Palestine, where you have now 3 generations have grown up in refugee camps. Or the slum-like dwellings into which refugees and migrants are often deposited. The physical space itself bespeaks marginalization or even invisibility vis-a-vis the dominant culture. The physical space carries with it all kinds of social indicators as well. It may involve a marginalization that might speak of ghettoization or segregation from proper members of the settled community. The social space in which diaspora groups find themselves speak of their relative social status vis-a-vis other communities in the same physical space as well. Now, students of human geography have come to regard as important how space gets turned into place. That is, how a physical space comes to be inhabited and remade by human groups. On this view, space may represent the physical coordinates of a location, whereas place encompasses the social relationships that fill that space. Those relationships are not only physical ones, but cultural, ideational, and spiritual ones as well. Thus, the social relations that make space a place may not entirely be in the spatial order. They may encompass sounds, especially language and song, hearing one's own language spoken. Smells, the aroma of food. There's been some interesting studies on how important local grocery stores are to ethnic enclaves because of the smells, because our olfactory senses are our most primitive sense. We can have pre-linguistic memories based on smell, and the smell of our favorite food, our comfort food, is indicative of that. And feelings, such as euphoria or unity. Indeed, as one author has put it, all of these together, in terms of talking about place, create a sensorium out of which place is produced. So you have to take into account all of the elements. Tom Tweed's name has been mentioned twice already this afternoon, and he's, after particularly his work on Our Lady of Charity, the shrine in Miami that we heard about extensively, has written a book with his theory of religion called Crossing and Dwelling. And there he talks about the importance that when you're talking about looking at religion, you don't simply look at the ideas or the doctrines or the rules, but he says you do have to look at those, but you have to look at the social relationships, you have to look at the material artifacts, and what he calls the embodied performances. So again, in Father Llewellyn's talk, the role of the processions, particularly, as these enactments, they're of Padre Jesus Nazareno. In other words, our place then becomes as much an act of the imagination as it is the result of any social engineering or social analysis. And I think this, I'll be coming back to this point, is a really essential one in this regard. In other words, to assess the place that a diaspora community creates requires an assessment of one of the longtime observers of this, Penina Verbner at the University of Calgary, has called the affective economy that is woven out of the spaces, sounds, smells, and the social imaginary of that community. That social imaginary is best captured in the polyvalent term home. At what point does a diaspora community become home to its inhabitants? Or does that community live perpetually within the thrall of the native land? Discontinuity versus continuity or integrity, space versus place, these dialectics lay out coordinates from which diasporas can be mapped and followed in their ongoing development within host countries and vis-a-vis their homelands. We need to turn now to the study of religion within diaspora communities. Now, to this point in time, religion has been a relatively under-researched area in this field of diaspora studies. Most commonly, when it does appear, it appears when extremist religious views are held by that diaspora community, and such views are seen as causal factors in antisocial behavior. So one thinks, for example, of second-generation migrant youths in Europe who come to subscribe to a violent interpretation of Islam, very different from the Islam of their parents, or the controversies in France around women wearing a veil. Such a relative lack of attention to religion can be ascribed to biases about religion often held in the secularist academy, that religion is a private affair on the verge of disappearance anyhow, or that it is consistently a negative factor in human relations. The resurgence of religion in the 1990s and the questioning of Max Weber's secularization hypothesis as applicable to human societies in general, rather than perhaps just to Europe, have caused some rethinking of the role of religion in international studies in general. And this awareness is causing some reconsideration of religion in transnational and diaspora studies. To be sure, religion has always been a kind of subtext in studying transnational phenomena. In other words, religious language will be used, but it's not allowed sometimes to surface. And an example of this would be, a really seminal work in this area was by Paul Gilroy, a British-born of Jamaican parents cultural critic. He wrote a book a little over 20 years ago called The Black Atlantic, which talks about the African diaspora as it circulates around the Atlantic. He didn't actually end up talking about Brazil, which was a shame because that's so interesting. We got to hear a little bit from Dr. Suarez this afternoon. But he did look at Europe and North America. And he talks there of a politics of transfiguration, but you would never guess where he got it from. The study of migrant communities, on the other hand, has provided a great deal of focus upon religion in those communities, and people in diaspora studies are trying to make use of that work. And this has been especially the case in the United States, the work that's been done on migrant communities, but also in parts of Europe, notably Great Britain. In the United States, the work of people such as Stephen Warner, who's emeritus here at UIC, here in Chicago, or of Helen Rose Ebaugh, come immediately to mind, both for their own work and the mentoring they have provided to younger scholars. In addition, a group of newer scholars have been adding significantly to this literature. Of course, you heard from Margarita Mooney this morning. While these studies have generally not focused specifically on the diaspora phenomenon as such, they can contribute much to our understanding of it. Now, a place to begin, perhaps in terms of summarizing some of the research findings on immigrant religion, would be something that Steve Warner published a number of years ago, where he makes 6 points about what we've learned from immigrant religion. I want to concentrate here for our purposes on just 2 of them. The first is that religion provides a source of continuity in the migrant experience between the homeland and the new location. As a source of continuity, it provides a stabilizing factor in the challenges to identity that the migration experience inevitably raises. Now, this is a significant feature for diaspora studies in that it provides an anchor in stormy seas of the migration experience. At the same time, of course, and this is the second of Warner's points that I want to bring out, those new challenges also change the experience of religion of the migrant. An example of this is how immigrant religious practice in this country of non-Christian religions will take on American congregational patterns. So the religions of India, for example, whose practice entails episodic visits to a temple or shrine, may take on the Sunday communal worship pattern in the U.S., not so much out of any doctrinal change, but rather from the fact that congregating around religious practice creates a place where one's own language may be spoken and understood, where one can enjoy the social status that is denied during the rest of the week, and where children may be socialized into homeland patterns. An example of that, again, here in Chicago are the Sikhs. In the northern suburbs, they have a temple. They meet on Sunday morning and have a potluck luncheon afterwards. They've picked up all the parts. And when asked, why they're doing that, he says, well, we can come together, we can speak our own language, and everybody understands it. We have people who are leaders of our community, they have status, and said most importantly, the young men and women meet each other so that they marry within the faith. But the American congregational pattern, now something which would be foreign to Sikhs in India, Religion in diaspora provides both a transnational and a local focus for the immigrant. The transnational dimension is enhanced if the religious tradition is itself avowedly transnational, as are the so-called world religions. Here, Roman Catholicism, by incorporating Catholicity in its very name, lays clear claim to transnationality. It is intended to be, and to be experienced as, always extending beyond the local or even national community. The transnational character gives the diaspora community a kind of compass by which to orient itself, mapping its own moral and spiritual geography onto political maps that now, those political maps only give us nation states. But we'll see this in a different way. By providing such an orientation, it can lessen the sharp feelings of discontinuity with the immediate environment in which the diaspora community may find itself. At the same time, it can provide a unique perspective on the local. The local is more than the opposite of the global or the global manqué. It can reveal hidden dimensions of the global, as well as critique its totalizing dimensions. The foreignness of the diaspora community can call into question how other local social configurations view or relate to global phenomena. What might be taken for granted as inevitable or self-evident in the dominant community is contested by the diaspora community. An example of this, again, we see in these communities, is the supervision of teenagers. Many migrant communities are surprised how unsupervised or unchaperoned teenagers are allowed to be in the dominant culture of the United States. But yet, for those who are part of the dominant culture, this unsupervised character is taken for granted, or sometimes even lauded, as respecting the freedom of teenagers. It's now time to turn more directly to religion in diaspora communities. Following the direction of diaspora studies, I'd like to concentrate on the dialectics of continuity, discontinuity, and space-place by looking more closely at displacement, or the rupture of place, and replacement in its double sense of resituating and substituting. The experience of rupture and displacement is often a defining characteristic of a diaspora community. It operates with a bifocal perspective, if you will. One eye, as it were, on the current location where it now is, and the other eye on its homeland. This perspective is acute in the first generation, and either fades or can be maintained in subsequent generations, depending upon the relative size of the community and its relationship to the dominant culture of its host country. In the fading process, usually language is the first thing to go. The generation born in the host country is likely to be more fluent in that country's language than in the language of their parents. A remarkable example of a Korean American, or an American of Korean descent, he was born in this country, was telling me, who works in this area, with him and his wife. His wife was also born in this country. Well, his wife took to, on antenna television, watching the Korean channel, because the soap operas on the Korean channel are subtitled in English. For people like her, whose Korean is a little shaky, and she's been trying to convince her teenagers to watch with her as a way of keeping up their Korean. This is a pretty well-known kind of fact. Mores and patterns of behavior specific to the home country are usually the next to fade. Usually the one thing that may endure is food. What may have been peasant food or food of the poor in the home country becomes special food for festive occasions in this setting. I used to work in a parish where there were a lot of people of Lithuanian descent, with the exception of one 89-year-old woman. None of them spoke Lithuanian. She would always come to me in confession and confess in Lithuanian. And I would say, well, she's 89 years old. She couldn't have done anything that serious. But we would make, for Easter, we would make kugelum, which is a heavy concentration of eggs and cream and potatoes. It's kind of an artery-busting sort of thing, so it's good that it's now only eaten once a year. But again, because that was a connection that this, now third generation, fourth generation Lithuanian family had. Religious practices may follow the same trajectory as other artifacts of culture. Hymns in the home language may fade from use as fewer people understand the words. Practices that may have anchored faith in the home country, here I'm thinking of the Mass that would be held, daily Mass that would be held at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning in Vietnamese villages, will not be replicated in the diaspora setting. The practices that survive may be attached to festive moments in the calendar, either liturgical festivals such as Christmas or Easter, or key transitions in life, such as weddings. In such instances, being displaced from the home setting means that the context for some practices have been lost. It renders those practices seemingly abstract and distant to the experience of younger members of the diaspora community. The loss of home can also beget nostalgia in a diaspora community, a yearning for an imagined past. Holding on to practices or even on to place can keep the nostalgia alive. Let me use the Chicago example again, because we are a city of immigrants. Here in Chicago, for example, there was a parish called Our Lady of Pompeii, which was the home parish for many Italian immigrants in Chicago's Little Italy. A number of years ago, it was slated to be closed and amalgamated with the neighboring parish. Well, there was a strong public protest against this proposal, coming especially from the children and grandchildren of immigrants who no longer lived in that neighborhood. In other words, it was not their parish church. The Archbishop at the time, Cardinal Bernardine, eventually bowed to this pressure, and Our Lady of Pompeii was reopened as a shrine. While it continues to attract the descendants of Italian immigrants, it also attracts a considerable number of other Catholics who are attracted by its programming and by the dynamic rector of the shrine. Shrines don't have pastors, they have rectors. What started as an act of nostalgia has taken on other dimensions. Our Lady of Pompeii thus has been both a sign of displacement, a site for nostalgia, and of replacement, a site, if you will, for the new evangelization that's going on, which is one of their programs. Religion can be a site for nostalgia in a displaced community, but it can also have other functions. It can also foster attempts to forge new bonds with the home community. Benedict Anderson identified this already 30 years ago in his now classic study, Imagined Communities. There he spoke of long-distance nationalism without responsibility. There he was talking of how diaspora communities would actually engage in the politics of their home country without having to live with the consequences. The involvement, for example, in this country of Irish immigrants and descendants of Irish immigrants in Boston who provided financial support for the Irish Republican Army is an example of this. But there are religious examples as well. Last year, I was contacted by a Sri Lankan diaspora community in Canada about an extended program on forgiveness that they had developed and hoped would be used in Sri Lanka to deal with the lingering effects of the civil war that had taken place there. And they were sending it to me, because I work in this area, for an evaluation of the program. Now this happened to be an Anglican community that had produced this program. However, a few months later, I was actually in Sri Lanka working with the Catholic Religious Conference of religious men and women of the orders of that country on issues of reconciliation between Tamils and Sinhalese. One of the things that I discovered rather quickly was how far away those two groups were from even talking about forgiveness. So much had to happen before talk about forgiveness could even begin. Now, I'm not calling the diaspora community who produced this program on forgiveness irresponsible. They created the program out of a deep sense of solidarity with those in their homeland. But even with the best intentions, they were out of touch with where most Sri Lankans found themselves at at this particular moment in time. Religion displaced can seem to lead to a whole range of negative outcomes, but are there some positive ones as well? Diaspora religion in a largely secular and pluralist setting, such as here in North America or Europe or Australia, can help, I believe, cultivate a sacramental vision. That is to say, the meaning of signs or signifiers are more complex than first imagined. That complexity reaches beyond what Charles Taylor, in his book, A Secular Age, is called the buffered self. In other words, a self that believes that there is this world and this world only and nothing beyond it. A number of writers have pointed to this sacramental quality as constitutive of the Catholic imagination. Again, to name just two Chicagoans. Andrew Greeley spoke of the sacramental imagination, and David Tracy of the analogical imagination. The experience of displaced religion may open up such an imagination, not only around things religious, but also for other cultural values as well. The significant role that migration plays in the biblical sense I didn't check my copy before I came, and page 14 did not print. The point I wanted to make here, it's somewhat related in a way to something that Father Llewellyn was saying as well, is that as migrant studies have shown us, the migrant narrative is fundamental both to the Jewish and the Christian story. And so for the diaspora communities may see also that the experience of diaspora is constitutive to these communities. Father Llewellyn made, I think, reference to this. And even the word we use for parish comes from paroikia, which means outside or beyond the home. And it was the idea of bringing together people who, to use Wayne Meeks' term, were cognitively dissonant with their community. So you had wealthy women who could lead these communities, but had no social status for making any kind of decisions within their communities on a political basis. So this, figures particularly strongly in this regard. Replacement. Replacement, as I said, can be both the sense of resituating and of being substitutional. Here, in the interest of time, I'm going to shift just to the, one example of replacement is Our Lady of Pompeii that I've just referred to. That while it's serving this particular nostalgic strain, but it's also creating a very dynamic other kind of community, at the same time. But replacement can also be substitutional. A classic case in this country was recounted in Robert Orsi's book, The Madonna of 115th Street, which is a study of what happened when different diaspora communities inhabited the same space. Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church in New York City's Harlem area, that's the 115th Street being referred to here, was, as the choice of the name might suggest, originally a church for Italian immigrants. One of the religious practices that they brought with them from their home country was a large outdoor procession held on the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, a very common part of popular religion. When the population of the neighborhood changed from Italian to Puerto Rican, the Hispanic community took over this celebration and made Our Lady of Mount Carmel their own. So they were a substitute in many ways. And in fact, because they continued, some of the Italians would come back and join it, even though it was now a Puerto Rican show, so to speak, rather than an Italian one. But there's been a further development at Our Lady of Mount Carmel since Orsi published his book in 1988. A researcher more recently found that Our Lady of Mount Carmel today has a substantial Haitian population. And they have brought with them the practice of voodoo, the Afro-Haitian religion. And the church now even provides a meeting place for voodoo practice in the church basement. Replacement of diaspora religion can take on other forms of substitution as well, as the Our Lady of Pompeii example as I just gave. There's another one. I wish I didn't have a chance to ask Dr. Suarez about this, because he was talking about candomblé. But at least one statistic that I read is that in the practitioners of candomblé today, the majority of them are not of African descent. Now, is that your take on the situation as well? So this was founded specifically, to bring together the Orishas of Yoruba religion, under the mask of Catholic saints, now is being practiced by a group that is not of African descent. And there are other examples. One of the most fascinating that I came across in Brazil is people of African descent joining Soka Gakkai, which is a fairly militant form of Japanese new religion. And so seeing all of these people of African descent going around saying, "Long live the emperor," meaning the emperor of Japan. And when you probe beneath that, what seems to be the case, and somewhat similar, I think, to the one that you were talking about, they see the Japanese immigrants as economically successful. So if this is their religion, they better try it. Let me conclude. The experience of religion in diaspora communities is marked by these dialectics of continuity and discontinuity and turning spaces into places. One can speak of religion being displaced, experiencing rupture and trauma, and of being replaced in both meanings of being resituated and being substituted. For Catholics, the transnational network, which is the Roman Catholic Church, adds an additional feature that could be the subject of another presentation. For example, it's possible to bring in personnel from different parts of the world to serve local congregations. The world was used to this, the Catholic world was used to this when it was called the missionary movement, but today the movement comes more from the so-called newer churches of Africa and Asia. Other forms of aid can be sought within this transnational network as well. It has also been suggested that diaspora communities may reveal something of the very heart of Christian identity, its sacramental vision. Now, others have looked at diaspora communities for other reasons. So there have been voices in Europe that have suggested that the whole church needs to become diaspora communities, to become what are called creative minorities, to revitalize a seemingly moribund church in a secularized culture. Whatever the reading, the emerging field of diaspora studies, drawing upon the work that has been done in the study of migration, may well become a rich resource for living out the Catholicity of Christian faith as we become truly a world church. Not just a world church in terms of demographics, where the most Catholics are, but in terms of our relationships, that they become genuinely mutual relationships as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was truly a tour de force. That was truly a global tour de force of the diaspora, and I appreciate that. We have time for maybe one or two questions. And again, if you could use the mic in the center.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Bob. I actually used the word diaspora in the title of my book. Faith Makes Us Live, Surviving and Thriving in the Haitian Diaspora, but I didn't actually engage with the concept. It was mostly it sounded really good, and it sounded better than Haitians in Miami, Montreal, and Paris. But my question for you is, towards the beginning, you spoke about the diaspora sort of people reconfiguring the past. And I wondered, given you've done so much work on reconciliation and you've worked so much in Africa, to what extent diasporas deal with the dead, right? So how do they construct a concept of community or memory over people who have died, right? So I'm thinking of Haitian migrants in Miami, the church where I work. There was a lot of memorials for people who were lost at sea making that journey. So I just wonder if you could speak to that.
Perhaps not so much there, but looking to the past becomes particularly important. And I can give you one glaring example where it's being evoked, but there is no past to go to. Before the conflict broke out again in South Sudan, a National Reconciliation Commission was set up. The Anglican Archbishop as the head of the commission, so that the religious community was very much brought together. But they're trying to seek a common narrative for the country, which has never been a country before, nor have they ever been together before. Most of the narrative has been of tribal conflict, mainly cattle raiding, because they're pastoralists, the two biggest groups, the Nuer and the Dinka. So there was no past, to go back to. It would be interesting, and I've only had marginal contact with that, but with the African diaspora communities now here in the United States, some of which are transnational networks too, founded from African instituted churches in Africa, like the Apostolic Zion Church, has two churches here in Chicago, following out to see whether they build a past in that kind of way. I was in one of their churches in Atlanta a number of years ago, and certainly that connection back was very important because the founder of the Apostolic Zion Church, or rather his son, was coming to visit, from Africa, and they were quite excited, about that. But then you get also, and I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but one of these from an African Pentecostal church, who was a student during the Soviet period, founded a African Pentecostal church in Kiev, in Ukraine. Now has 30,000 members. And these are all Ukrainians. These are not Africans. But they're worshiping, under this particular style. So that's yet another kind of angle. So, it is fascinating stuff, what's coming out of this. Yes?
Okay, maybe one more question?
Thank you, Robert, for quite a stimulating presentation. Well, I have to speak because I'm more like a diaspora student. In fact, Robert Cohen was my supervisor, so who is an expert on diasporas. I could relate your talk perhaps to what I call classical diaspora studies, those that emphasizes the homeland. When you talk of course, of place and space, the dialectic. But I think because when you quoted Paul Gilroy and yeah, and his Black Atlantic, you almost disrupt fixed place territory. It's not Africa. Home is not Africa. It's not North America. It's not Europe. In fact, I think new scholars of diasporas, are much more attentive to this deteriorized sort of diasporas that have no fix, for example, Roma gypsies, even the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. Can you perhaps move to that direction, of maybe moving from the classical understanding of a diaspora in terms of how it is fixed to place, to new forms, perhaps what Rogers Brubaker said, perhaps people who claim that diaspora is existence or is a category of practice, you know. In that way, perhaps it will help us to understand about religious diaspora, because how can you talk about the religious diasporas that they have no homeland to speak about? What is their homeland? And Gabriel Schaeffer said that is why perhaps religious communities or global communities can't be diasporas, because they know this country of origin, that homeland. So how can we talk of religious diaspora?
Well, what you're calling for is an extension of the term diaspora, you know, to cover these other areas. And as I tried to make the point, there's an intersection here between migrant communities, you know, and what's being called diaspora communities under this rubric of diaspora studies. Certainly the point, you know, of looking at practices and so on, you know, I did make some reference to that. You can't simply look at a number of things. The whole social imaginary that's drawn upon and enacted and then even revised and developed has to be attended to in this kind of thing. So it can't simply be reduced to the relationship to the homeland. And I think part of what this is saying is just because people move, that doesn't make them diaspora communities, because they can end up being scattered, you know, in different kinds of ways. So that's part of this is still, you know, as a discrete area of study, is still relatively new. I think another factor figures in that I tried to make a point about is that we sometimes make diaspora communities too static. We're only looking at the experience of the first generation. And subsequent generations may look at things differently. I was a consultant a number of years ago to the Archdiocese of Southwark, which is London below the Thames, because they were trying to organize better their multi-ethnic ministry. And they had chosen the model from Erga Migrantes, the document that Dr. Suarez referred to earlier, of having chaplaincies, you know, for each group. So I said, well, how many chaplaincies do you have? And they said 92. I said, well, I guess I can see why you're having a little trouble managing that. And they said, well, and the thing is, you know, and then they singled out, they took me actually to the Togolese community, which had broken into two along generational issues. You know, how much they should stay aligned with the remembered homeland or not. So I think it's a key thing in all of this is, you know, migrant studies has taught us a long time ago that you know, the experience of the first generation is not completely replicated in the next generation. And it's remembered, it's honored, but the experience under which people have grown up can be quite different. And then the third generation, sometimes, you know, will get even another round of nostalgia for their grandparents' world. So, I mean, those are some of the different dimensions, you know, that I think are playing into that.
Well, let's give Bob another round of applause.